Welcome to the first Cheerful Pharmacist video podcast. This podcast is an introduction to medical cannabis and is the first episode out of a series of episodes that I will be doing on medical cannabis. And throughout these episodes, I will address questions like, what is medical cannabis? How is it different from recreational and their prescription cannabinoid products? What is THC? What is CBD? What is the evidence surrounding medical cannabis, and how a pharmacist might be involved in your treatment with medical cannabis. Now, I am a pharmacist in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and the nature of my work is actually in chronic disease management. So I see a lot of rheumatic diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis. And one of the most common reasons for taking medical cannabis or cannabis is for the treatment of pain. Now, my role as a pharmacist is to assess whether or not medical cannabis, first of all, is appropriate, because there are conditions where it probably wouldn't be a good idea to start medical cannabis. And for example, it's also not considered a first line treatment. Before you consider medical cannabis, you should have tried other standard conventional treatments. And the other component is that I help somebody select or find the appropriate product, because there are so many different products and so many different licensed producers. They all have different concentrations, different products. How do you know which product to select and which CBD THC ratio to use? In pain, we actually have a sweet spot that we need to find in order for cannabis to work effectively. Below that spot and above that, below that dose and above that dose, we actually will not be able to see a very effective response. The other component is that there are drug interactions with medical cannabis, and my job is to ensure that I've managed everybody's medical cannabis as well as any side effects that occur. Now, before I begin or delve further into this podcast, I do want to remind everyone that this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace the advice of your healthcare providers. This podcast and my Instagram and everything I do on social media is for my own personal interest in delivering health information to the general public and is separate from my affiliation with the University of British Columbia. Now, what is medical cannabis? Medical cannabis is a flowering plant with over 500 chemicals, such as cannabinoids, terpenes, pinene, and flavonoids. And the two components, or the two chemicals that we are probably most familiar with because we've heard a lot about it in the media, is THC and CBD. These are cannabinoids. Now, THC stands for delta-4 tetrahydrocannabinol, and CBD stands for cannabidiol. We call these cannabinoids from cannabis phytocannabinoids because they come from plants. But our bodies also naturally produce cannabinoids, and in the body we call those cannabinoids endocannabinoids, and they are structurally similar to THC and CBD, which is why THC and CBD can't even impart an effect on our body in the first place. I will talk more about this later on and how these chemicals interact with our body. There's also synthetic cannabinoids. So these are lab synthesized cannabinoids, and these are the prescription cannabis products. For example, there's nabilone, otherwise known as Sesamet, and Marinol, otherwise known as dronabinol. And both of these are prescription cannabis products. And again, I will talk more about them later. You may have heard of the term hemp. Hemp is a type of cannabis that contains less than 0.3% THC, and it is cultivated around the world for its fiber and seeds. We use the fiber for things like plastics, textiles, and paper, and we use the hemp seed oil in things like cosmetics, fuel, and cooking. Now, medical cannabis refers to cannabis derived from the whole plant, and it is a regulated product that requires a medical document or prescription from your prescriber. It is different from recreational cannabis, which is not regulated and so not subject to inspections, quality control, and it doesn't require a prescription or medical document from a prescriber. You also may have heard of the terms cannabis sativa and cannabis indica. These are the different strains of cannabis, and essentially they're different plants. One is tall, one is short, one has narrow leaves, one has broader leaves. And sativa actually originated in Europe and indica from Asia. And sativa, cannabis sativa, has historically been labeled as a strain with an uplifting and energizing effect, while indica, cannabis indica, a calming and sedative effect. But there's actually no scientific basis to these claims because the effect is highly individualized and people have reported those effects to either strain. So knowing what the strain is doesn't exactly tell you how you're going to react to the cannabis. And it also doesn't tell you what the biochemical content is or the THC CBD ratio. I'll get into that a little bit later on in the podcast. But basically, knowing the strain is really not going to tell you what it's going to do or how you're really going to respond to the cannabis. And when we look at medical cannabis, you will see that it actually the products are labeled as ratios, and those ratios are referring to CBD and THC. And so, for example, you're going to see products that say a 1-to-1 CBD to THC ratio. That means that the concentration of CBD is the same as the concentration of THC. Now, one 1-to-1 product is not necessarily identical to another 1-to-1 product, and that is because it is just referring to a ratio. The concentration of those products can be different. For example, a 1-to-1 product could have 25 milligrams per mil of both THC and CBD, but another 1-to-1 product could actually be 12.5 milligrams per mil. And so the ratio doesn't necessarily tell you the potency or the concentration of the product either. Now, the other very common ratio is CBD to THC of 25-to-1. I use this with my patients all the time, and a CBD to THC ratio of 25-to-1 means that there's 25 times more CBD than there is THC. Now, like I said, there are so many different products for medical cannabis, and so there are varying concentrations, but there are 3 different chemotypes in cannabis, and they are THC predominant, CBD predominant, and mixed types. So THC predominant means that there is a lot more THC than there is CBD, and CBD predominant means that there's a lot more CBD than there is THC. And then there are mixed types, so there's varying concentrations. Now, THC gets its bad rep because it's associated with the use of recreational drugs and is classified as a psychoactive drug. Sometimes you're going to hear people describe CBD as a non-psychoactive drug, but that's actually not true. What they really mean is CBD is a non-intoxicating drug. CBD is very much a psychoactive drug because it is a mood-altering substance. And the definition of a psychoactive drug is a substance that alters the central nervous system and brain function and temporarily changes your mood, perception, behavior, and consciousness. So because CBD can alter our mood and perception, it actually does have the potential to be used as an anticonvulsant, anxiolytic, and antipsychotic. Now, THC, on the other hand, like I said, is a psychoactive drug and is actually the component that is responsible for the high, the euphoria, cognitive impairment, memory impairment, and difficulty concentrating, which is why it is very unsafe to drive after consuming THC, although to be fair, it is also unsafe to drive after consuming CBD, depending on how it affects you as well. Now, THC naturally mimics an endocannabinoid in our body called anandamide. And I said earlier that endocannabinoids or cannabinoids basically interact with the what we call the endocannabinoid system, otherwise known as the ECS. Now, most body processes are affected by the ECS. The ECS essentially regulates and controls very critical bodily functions like learning and memory, emotional processing, pain, inflammatory responses, and immune responses. And naturally occurring chemicals in our body interact with this ECS to dial up and down the activity of those processes. And we have receptors in the ECS throughout our body. They are in our peripheral nervous system, the central nervous system, our reproductive system, the heart, liver, bone, for example. And anandamide, as I mentioned earlier, is actually involved in the regulation of mood, pain, appetite, and cognition, among many other things. And when THC is in our bodies, it will affect those processes, which is why THC has the potential to be used as an antiemetic, which is for reducing nausea and vomiting, as a painkiller, as an anti-inflammatory agent, an appetite stimulant, and an antispasmodic. Now, I said earlier that there are varying amounts of THC and CBD in cannabis. In general, we're not really going to see 100% CBD or 100% THC products. We do find them. They're not very common, and I don't generally recommend those because they're probably going to be less effective because you lose out on what we call the entourage effect that comes from the whole cannabis plant. The entourage effect is a greater or enhanced effect of cannabis from the whole plant than with the individual's THC or CBD extracts. And there are various components of the whole plant that interact synergistically to create this entourage effect, and they boost and complement the effects of, for example, THC and CBD. So kind of like a symphony, the music you get from multiple musicians is going to sound very different from the music coming from a soloist. Now, medical cannabis refers to cannabis derived from the whole plant, so it's going to have all the chemicals that's required to create that entourage effect, which is why medical cannabis, for the most part, is probably going to be more effective than prescription synthetic cannabinoid products. Now, current data actually suggests that plant-based or plant-derived cannabinoids, so medical cannabis, actually increase the odds of improvement for pain by approximately 40%. With prescription cannabinoids, I mentioned that there are some synthetic ones, and those are nabilone and dronabinol. And dronabinol is actually not available in Canada anymore because it was withdrawn from the market by the manufacturer. But nabilone and dronabinol are actually both used in chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, as well as AIDS-related anorexia. And nabilone has also been used in neuropathic pain and pain in palliative patients. Now, there are also 2 prescription plant-derived cannabinoid products, and they are called Sativex and Epidiolex. Sativex is a natural cannabis extract that contains both equal quantities of THC and CBD, so that's kind of like your one-to-one medical cannabis product, and it is officially used to treat spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis in those who are not responding to conventional therapies. There's also a drug called Epidiolex, which is it's not available in Canada, but it is basically a plant-derived CBD product that's used to treat very resistant forms of epilepsies in those who are 2 years of age and older. Now, medical cannabis is legal in many parts of the world, and more countries are now legalizing cannabis and decriminalizing cannabis. Why? Because it is a low-risk drug. The concern was that it can become a gateway for other substances if not used appropriately. And medical cannabis, medical or recreational cannabis is legal in Canada. And in the US, 43 out of the 50 states and the District of Columbia have legalized medicinal cannabis, although only 6 of these states allow only CBD oil. It's also medical cannabis is also legal in parts of Europe, such as Germany, Italy, and the UK. Now, the UK is an interesting one because despite having legalized it, it's still not really prescribed. And the reason it got legalized was actually because a mom had flown over to Canada, bought some CBD oil to treat her daughter who had a very treatment-resistant form of epilepsy, and her cannabis supply was confiscated at customs. And after it got confiscated and she had no oil to use for her daughter's health deteriorated and ended up being hospitalized with life-threatening seizures. And after that incident, the family was granted a special medical cannabis license to obtain and use medical cannabis. And after that, medical cannabis gained a lot more public attention and support. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of barriers that make medical cannabis inaccessible to many people. And it's not just in the UK, but also in other parts of the world. And we see it in Canada and the US as well. Essentially, many physicians are not familiar with the use of medical cannabis, nor do they know how to prescribe it, what dose to use, when to use, for example, because it wasn't ever taught in the programs. And we're also seeing hesitancy in prescribing medical cannabis because professional regulatory bodies and clinicians want additional or further evidence and randomized controlled trials that look at the risk versus benefits of CBD and THC. Now, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for evaluating whether a drug is going to be effective. And it's not that we don't have data. We do have data. In fact, we have randomized controlled trial data. We just don't have a lot of data because we just don't have a lot of data they're looking for. So we have a lot of data that's in smoked or vaporized a THC, which is in general not what we would be using in medical cannabis. In medical cannabis, we generally use oils because it's easier to titrate up and down a dose and also to get the exact dose and find the dose that works for somebody. And also, we generally don't use, unless it's for very specific situations, we generally don't see a lot of people using high THC. We do see a lot of people using a 1-to-1 product or a high CBD, low THC product. Now, there is actually substantial or conclusive evidence that cannabis is effective in a variety of conditions. And those conditions are chronic pain, chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and spasticity related to multiple sclerosis. And the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine at the NASM actually came up with a report to support this. And you can find that report online as well. Now, we do have insufficient evidence to support the use of medical cannabis in a variety of conditions as well. And those include the symptoms from irritable bowel syndrome, the treatment of cancer, acute pain, and skin diseases, to name a few. But now that it's legal, we are probably going to see a lot more research. And what was limiting all that data and randomized controlled trials is actually that because of legal restrictions, researchers could not even obtain cannabis to study in the first place. So now that it's legalized, we are going to see a lot more trials, a lot more data. For example, the UK just opened up the patient registry for for cannabis, and that means we'll be able to collect data on, doses that people are using, side effects, and whether or not it's effective in, certain medical conditions. Now, I do want to point out that in medical cannabis, like I said earlier, it is not a first-line treatment type of medication. And without having tried other conventional first-line therapies, we shouldn't exactly be using medical cannabis yet. Now, if you are interested or if you are considering medical cannabis, I do encourage you to look for a healthcare provider. That could be a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a pharmacist that has experience handling medical cannabis, because there are drug interactions. And it is important to find somebody who can support you, because we know that if you have the right support, you're probably more likely to find better success with medical cannabis than having to figure out what product are you going to use, or what dose are you going to start with, how do you titrate up and down the dose, for example. So I do suggest that if you can find that healthcare team, to look for them, because it would be the appropriate way of going about medical cannabis. Now, there are a number of pharmacies in British Columbia that are where you will have a pharmacist help you with managing your medical cannabis. It does, of course, require a prescription from the doctor first, but you've got a pharmacist who's going to follow you from the beginning all the way until the end. And a lot of my patients have found that to be incredibly helpful. In my next couple of podcasts, I will describe some cases that I've had that I think would be of interest to people who are considering medical cannabis. And in my future podcasts, I will be talking about medical cannabis versus recreational cannabis, and how you would go about obtaining a medical cannabis prescription. I hope you found this podcast helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comment section of the podcast. Thank you for watching or listening to the Cheerful Pharmacist podcast.